as we get to the end of the year and get to the end of this decade, I am going to start doing some top 10 rankings, and I'm going to start with looking at the top 10 worst MLS team this decade. I kind of got this idea a couple of weeks ago when Bobby Warshar wrote a article on MLSsoccer.com. Well, actually not an article, but more like kind of like a countdown where he count down the top 5 best MLS team from this decade, and he wrote 5 separate article to highlight these 5 teams, and that the 5th article that he wrote revealed who is the best MLS team this decade. And I'm going to do something similar to that next week, where I look at not the top 5 best MLS team this decade, but the top 10 best MLS team this decade. But today, I'm going to look at the top 10 worst MLS team this decade, and it's hard to believe, but as much as we think about all these teams that are considered the top tier team in MLS, and that these teams consistently make MLS playoffs, and that they also have a lot of ambition in terms of spending big money so that they can, of course, get into the playoffs. Let's not forget that we also have teams that do the opposite of that, which is not being ambitious and not really think about potentially challenge for MLS Cup, and kind of stuck on a just a hamster wheel of a rebuild where they just cannot get themselves to the next level and get themselves compete in the playoffs. And that some of these teams are kind of like that from this decade, and that these 10 worst MLS team from this decade, if you're a fan of one of these teams, definitely my condolence is to you, and especially these team that is near the lower part of the rankings. My condolence is to you to have to suffer and deal of the team that you support, that you have to see them being very bad every single year. But let's hope things will improve as they head into this new decade. And this is why sometime in sports, just because you have a bad year, heading into a new season, everything changes. You get off to a fresh start, and maybe things can change. Now, having said that, some people would basically argue with me and say that, well, if you think that everything is going to change after a bad year, and things doesn't change, and you still have those kind of feeling, then that's kind of the definition of insanity. But I guess that's kind of the way to look at for some of these teams that have been just so bad this decade, that you just gotta maybe keep a positive mind in terms of hoping that the next year, or maybe heading into this new decade, that your team will be much better than what has happened in the last decade. But either way, enough of me kind of giving you guys positive vibes in terms of some of these teams that are considered the worst team in this decade. Let's talk about the top 10 team, and let's start with number 10. And this team actually was a team that started their first ever season in the beginning of this decade, and a team that has known to cause a lot of heartbreaks for their fan base, and that, of course, is the Philadelphia Union. The Union, they obviously started MLS in a pretty bad way, where they spent their first 4 out of their first 5 season without a playoff appearance. But that wasn't really the most painful part. The most painful part about the Union is that they could have easily won maybe 1, 2, 3, or even 4 trophies from this season. I mean, when you look at this Union team from this decade, they have suffered a lot of heartbreaks, and a lot of heartbreaks in terms of cup finals, because they lost 3 Open Cup final this decade, and that this also includes back in 2014 and 2015, where back-to-back years they were in the Open Cup final, and I believe in 2015 they were playing at home in the Open Cup final, and they lost both of them. And that recently in 2018, when they were playing against Houston on the road, where they were the favorites coming into that match, considering the Dynamo was not having a great season in that cup final, they still lost that one. So, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of disappointment and a lot of just kind of heartbreak that Union fans have to deal with. But the good news is, at least they finally won a playoff series, and they finally got over the hump that is kind of the problem that they also have in terms of the theme of heartbreak, which is they haven't won a playoff series until this season, when they finally won a playoff series and beat the Red Bulls in the first round. So hopefully that's just a start of them doing well and maybe move on into MLS Cup and maybe make progress as they go along whenever they make the playoffs. But we shall see with this Union team as they're heading into this new decade. And at number 9, speaking of heartbreaks, this team is also no stranger to heartbreaks. And while the Union, they have suffered, I think, the most heartbreaking loss and the most loss in an Open Cup final, the New England Revolution have suffered the most MLS Cup final loss out of any team in MLS. They lost 4 MLS Cup, and 3 of them, of course, came in the last decade, and one of them actually came in this decade back in 2014 when they lost to the Galaxy. And besides that, there isn't really a lot of things that you could say that the Revs did very well. I mean, occasionally they do make the playoffs, although the last couple of years it's been relatively tough, and especially under Brad Friedel, that was definitely very tough time to be a Revs fan, especially the second half part when Brad Friedel took over that team. But yeah, the Revs, they aren't considered the worst team this decade, because at least they appear at an MLS Cup, and at least they do have some playoff appearance, but most of those playoff appearance besides 2014 doesn't really end up of them going deep into the playoffs, and that's why they, of course, are in number 9. In number 8, this is a team that I think is a team that came, I believe, in the same year as the Union, or maybe the year after. I think the Whitecaps came in either in 2010 or 2011. I believe it might be 2011. But this is a team that actually have won silverware, and you notice there are going to be some teams I'm going to put here that actually have won silverware this decade. But the reason why I put them in this board is because other than the only silverware that they have won, there isn't really a lot that they have been able to cheer for. And in other words, that silverware are kind of like a little bit of an outlier. And for the Whitecaps, their only silverware came in 2015 when they won the Canadian Championship, which I guess some people might not consider that as silverware. Consider the Canadian Championship is just it's a trophy that is so easy to win for any MLS team that is north of the border, and that it's just a trophy that tends to only win by MLS team. And somehow, in some way, despite that, the Whitecaps have only won it once, while I think Montreal won it 3 times, and Toronto won the most out of that trophy. And other than that, they had the occasional playoff appearance like New England has, and most of those playoff appearances ends up in heartbreak and doesn't really get them deep into the playoffs. And now they're getting into the period where this is probably the darkest period in their time of being in MLS, and that last season it was supposed to be a rebuild year where it was supposed to give them maybe a sign of progress that things can improve. Instead, they went backwards in the rebuild, and that now they're going to have to restart and try to start up this rebuild again, and that hopefully with them starting this deep rebuild again, they can see some progress where they definitely did not see from last season and just kind of gone backwards. Number 7. Now, there are some teams that I'm going to put here that are teams that are expansion team, either from the beginning or near the back end of the decade. And this is one of the teams that I put that is in the back end of the decade as the top 10 worst MLS team. And I kind of feel bad to put these expansion teams that is kind of like in the back end of the decade and haven't been playing MLS for more than 4 years to be on this list. But I feel like Minnesota, I kind of want to just put them there because besides what happened this year where the third-year plan actually worked, which result of them getting into the U.S. Open Cup final and getting their first ever playoff appearance, yeah, things have not been good for Minnesota besides that. And even in the playoffs, I feel like that was kind of disappointing, even though it was their first playoff appearance and there was really nothing to expect for them. You would think that they probably should have won that game and that they were the only team in the first round, or the only home team in the first round to actually lose, and that other home teams from the first round all won their games. So, because of that, I consider that kind of like a disappointment, and that, besides that, when you look at the first 2 years of Minnesota, it was definitely hard to look at that team and think that they were going to do something spectacular as they did in the third season, where they were giving up tons and tons of goal in those 2 years, and especially the first year where it was just, I think they were finishing near the bottom of the table, and they gave up like the most goal in MLS history while not scoring a lot of goals. So not only it was a team that was not entertaining to watch, but it was a team that is not entertaining to watch where they just ship goals like crazy every single game. And then at number 6 is another team that has recently came into the league, and this team actually just came into the league last season, and this might be very harsh. To be fair, including Minnesota here is kind of harsh enough that this just feels wrong to put FC Cincinnati on this list, even though they only played in MLS just one season. But that one season result in one of the worst expansion team season in the history of MLS. And that if it wasn't for Chivas USA with that abysmal 18-point run that they had in their inaugural year, FC Cincinnati would have had the worst point total out of any expansion team in MLS history. And yeah, I mean, to say that this team was just happy to be in MLS is kind of an understatement, because it seemed like they were just giving points every single week to opponent like it's nothing. Like they were probably, if there is probably a team that you would be most thankful for throughout the season, you would say it's FC Cincinnati, because they tend to give up 3 points to everybody and tends to lose very badly to teams every single game. Now, at the back part of the season, they kind of started to get a little bit serious, and that they started to do much better than the middle part, and even after just right after when they kind of started very well with them even being in the playoff position, and actually had a stretch where they went unbeaten in 3 games, and then the rest was just absolutely garbage, and that everything just fell apart after their that. But still, because of the fact that they're one of the worst expansion team in MLS history, it's kind of hard for me to like not put them on this board. But at the same time, you can make the argument the fact that I kind of feel like I'm being a bit harsh to put them on this board, even though they just played one season in MLS. And I'm going to probably say this at the end of the video, but I'll just remind you right now that in case if you disagree with any of the team that I put on the board, let me know in the comments below. And also let me know in the comments below, what do you think is the top 10 worst MLS team from this decade? At number 5, and this is actually the only team on this list that won an MLS Cup, and you would think a team that won an MLS Cup would not be on this board and would be actually exempt from considered the top 10 worst MLS team this decade. Not the Colorado Rapids. And I know they won MLS Cup back in 2010, but that feels like forever since they had won that MLS Cup, and that it felt like a long time ago that they won that MLS Cup. I mean, ever since that MLS Cup win, they have barely been in the playoffs. I think they only been in the playoffs twice. The most recent one was back in 2016, which they almost went to MLS Cup again by coming very close to beating the Seattle Sounders in the conference final. But other than that, it's been kind of abysmal for the Rapids for the last couple of seasons. And part of that is because this is just one of those teams that is very. It was a very dull kind of team that doesn't score a lot of goals, but at the same time, they don't give up like ton of goals. And in the last couple of years, not only the fact that they don't score a lot of goals, but they started to also give up a ton of goals, and that they end up becoming one of the worst MLS team in the league standings. So yeah, that's why I put the Rapids there. Although knowing the fact that they're started to kind of improve, and that they, when you look at some of the players that they got on their roster and some of the players that they signed this offseason, I won't be surprised if this team can potentially make the playoffs heading into this next year or two. At number 4 is my team, the San Jose Earthquakes. And I'm actually going to say this. I'm going to kind of say the same reason why I put the Quakes here as I said with the Rapids, where, you know, with the Rapids, they, of course, did win MLS Cup in 2010, but other than that, there wasn't really a lot of highlight, and the rest of the season have just been kind of stuck in mediocrity and kind of just stuck of being one of the laughing stock in the league. That's the same with the Quakes. The Quakes, they didn't make MLS Cup this decade, but they did win the Supporters Shield in 2012. And yes, I know some people will dispute and say that they got lucky in that season of winning Supporters Shield, considered they had probably the most wins that came from a 90th minute win, or 90th minute winner, or a stoppage time winner, and that was just part of the Goonies kind of era from the Quakes. You know, some people will kind of dispute that, but still, at the end of the day, they won the Supporters Shield. They had the best record in MLS that year. But other than that, there isn't really a lot to highlight from the Quakes. I mean, I know in 2010, they made it to the conference semifinal before losing that. And then in 2017, we know that they finally ended what was back then the longest playoff drought at 5 seasons by making the playoffs with a -22 goal differential, only to get smacked by Vancouver 5-0 in the first round. So, other than that, there really isn't a lot of joy for Quakes fans, but let's just hope that in these next couple of seasons, with the fact that Almeida is in charge of this team, and just pray to God the front office can finally start thinking about spending big and being a little bit more ambitious with improving this team, that this team could be just as good as they were in the early part of this team's history. And that people forget the Quakes used to be a model organization back in the early 2000s and winning MLS Cup. And number 3 is another one of those teams that actually have less than 6 years of being in the league, and this team kind of came in the middle of the decade, but I'm putting them this low in the table mainly because Orlando City does not have a playoff win or a playoff appearance, and that besides FC Cincinnati, they're the only team in MLS right now that does not have a playoff appearance. In fact, they're also the team that currently have the longest playoff drought out of any team at 5 seasons. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a really tough time to be an Orlando City fans for the past couple of years. And to make things worse, their biggest rival, Atlanta, you know, while they endure this suffering, they have to watch Atlanta win MLS Cup and being kind of like the darling of MLS, and they're just kind of getting stuck at the bottom of the table. But one thing I will say about Orlando City is that I think eventually they're going to get their first playoff appearance, and especially hiring Oscar Pereira, who, you know, he is a guy that knows to play the youth and tends to implement some talented youth player and gel them into kind of a playoff team. And I know Orlando City does have a very good youth academy, and that if Pereira can basically work with that and do something similar that he did with FC Dallas, then no doubt Orlando City will finally get their first playoff appearance and finally give this kind of almost a long-suffering fan base something to finally be glad about. I mean, I know 5 years isn't really long, but in MLS kind of perspective and the fact that you currently owns the longest playoff drought, 5 years is definitely a very, very long time. And number two, um, this team, boy oh boy, this team has been just. I don't know what to say about this team other than the fact that no doubt this team, in many people's mind, is considered the worst team this decade. And that, of course, is the Chicago Fire. I mean, it's hard to believe, but if I would have done this ranking back in 2009, where I look at the top 10 worst MLS team from the 2000 all the way up to 2009, the Chicago Fire not only will not be on this list, but they might be on my other list of the top 10 best MLS team from this decade. Because this team, in their first 10 to 15 years of existence, were considered a model organization and considered one of the best organizations in MLS history. Heck, this is still the only team in MLS history to ever win an MLS Cup in their expansion year back in 1997. But ever since the turn of the decade and ever since the calendar turned to 2010, it has just been nothing but suckerage from the Chicago Fire. Actually, I don't even know if suckerage is actually a word. I kind of made up with that. But yeah, I mean, when you look at this decade, 2 playoff appearances, both of them resort into first round losses. They had a time between 2012 to 2017, along with the Quakes, of owning the longest playoff drought in MLS. And not to mention the fact that this team actually won back-to-back wooden spoon. And I think since the word wooden spoon has been thrown around and since it's now made officially a trophy, that I think they're the only team to ever have back-to-back season that were considered the worst team in MLS that season. And you know, not to mention the fact that when you look at the last couple of years and even the last 2 seasons, the Fire didn't really had a lot of success. Like after that year when they made the playoffs in 2017, they took a complete nosedive in 2018 and once again become one of the worst team in MLS. This season, or last season that is, they were a team that was just so inconsistent that you just don't know which kind of Fire teams will show up. You know, sometimes they can be a Fire team that can be showcased as a team that was so dominant in the early 2000s. And then there are sometimes where they showcase the Chicago Fire team that resemble this decade, which is just one of the worst team, if not the worst MLS team from this decade. But they're not on my list. My worst team from this decade, and I know this team doesn't exist anymore because this is the last MLS team to this day to actually no longer exist and actually dissolve. But Chivas USA, no doubt, in my opinion, is the worst team in MLS history. And some people might say, well, I can't really put them as the worst team in MLS history when they only play 4 years in this decade before they, of course, dissolve. No. That's not how I do this rankings. And, you know, when you look at Chivas USA and throughout their club history, they obviously got off to that disastrous start in their inaugural year and still to this day own a unwanted record of being the worst expansion team in MLS history. But they kind of had a good spell in the late 2000s, and then as the calendar turns to 2010, that's when they started to just go downhill and took a big nosedive. And, you know, unlike the Chicago Fire, where they kind of took a nosedive and they kind of just stuck there, and eventually they kind of got it together with a couple of playoff appearances. During those time and leading up to them potentially folding, they made 0 playoff appearance, and they didn't even came close in any of those seasons of making the playoffs. And you know, anytime when you are a team that is just so bad, and the fans of course started to stay away from watching you at the stadium, and then you eventually run into financial issue, you deserve the title of being the worst MLS team this decade. But either way, hope you guys enjoy this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments below, do you agree with this list, or if there are some teams that you think should be ranked a little bit lower in terms of the worst MLS team, or some teams that is ranked way too low in terms of the top 10 worst MLS team this decade. But either way, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.